Now let's look at the next data set. So we have mental health in tech, and just looking at the data frame, we have a bunch of survey questions. Are you self-employed? How many employees does your company or organization have? And so on. And then there's probably a lot of them because we have 63 columns. And then we also have some demographic information. So age, gender, country, state, county, country you work in, and basically locations for tech workers, and also position and whether they work remotely. Um, so some of these columns are going to have to do with mental health issues. I don't know that we. Let's actually look at the data and see what we have. So I'm going to re-execute this read CSV and then add a cell, and then let's explore the data and see what we get. And let me make this a little smaller here. So we have 1433 rows, and 1433 responses to whether you're self-employed, only 1146 to how many employees does your company or organization have, 263 to is your primary role within the company related to tech or IT, and so on. So I'm just going to read the questions. Does your employer provide mental health benefits? So we can look at percentage of employers that provide benefits. Do you know the options for mental health care available under your coverage? Has your employer ever formally discussed mental health? Does your employer offer resources to learn more about mental health concerns? Is your anonymity protected? So we could look at the impact of anonymity on something. If a mental health issue prompted you to request a medical leave from work, asking for that leave could be. And then I have to look at what the values are to say what this means. Do you think that discussing a mental health disorder with your employee would have negative consequences? That's an interesting question. Do you think that discussing physical health issue with your employer would have negative consequences? So for many of these questions that are sort of yes no questions, what you can do is you can look at the proportion of employees that answered yes or no, and then order different values by those percentages. So for example, we know job titles, and so what we can do is for all the employees with a particular job title, we can calculate what percentage of them thought that discussing mental health disorders with their employer would have negative consequences. And then we can order those job titles by the job titles where the highest percentage of employees thought that there would be negative consequences, or any of these others. So basically, you can say which job titles feel particularly vulnerable to discussing mental health disorders, or which job titles feel most comfortable discussing those things. And then same thing with coworkers, same thing with direct supervisors. Do you feel that your employer takes mental health as seriously as physical health? That might be something that some states take more seriously than other states. And so you could rank the states by the percentage of employers who took mental health as seriously as physical health. Have you heard or observed negative consequences? Do you have medical coverage? So maybe some states have medical coverage and other states don't. Do you know local or online resources to seek help for mental health disorder? If you've been diagnosed or treated for mental health disorder, do you ever reveal this to clients or business contacts? If you've revealed a mental health issue to client or business contact, do you believe this has impacted you negatively? So follow-on questions. Do you reveal to coworkers or employees? Has it impacted you negatively? Do you believe productivity is ever affected by mental health issues? So this would be a key um, outcome that we could look at various other factors that might have an impact here. So are there particular job categories or particular states where people feel that their productivity has been affected by mental health issues? If yes, what percentage of your work time is affected by a mental health issue? Do you have previous employers? Have your previous employers provided mental health benefits? So once again, coverage for benefits for mental health issues. Were you aware of the options for mental health? Did your previous employers ever formally discuss mental health? Did your previous employers provide resources? Is your anonymity protected? Did you think that discussing them? And then these are repeats of the same questions except for previous employers. And then would you bring up mental health issues with a potential employer in an interview? And then there's some why or why nots where I expect there would be some notes there, but it's notoriously hard to pull anything meaningful or quantitative out of free format notes. So we'd have to look at those values. Do you feel that being identified as a person with a mental health issue would hurt your career? So that's an important outcome to look at by state and by job function. Do you think that team members would view you more negatively? How willing would you be to share this with friends or family? Have you observed or experienced an unsupportive or badly handled response? Lots of interesting questions, but I think we're just going to pull off a couple of big questions and then not worry about the details so much. Do you have a family history of mental illness? Even that, just people who have a history of mental illness, and then the percentage of people who report negative consequences or negative effects from mental health issues compared with people that don't have a family history. Even just ignoring the fact that this is in the tech sector, just looking at that breakdown might be interesting. People who have had mental health disorders in the past versus people who have suffered negative consequences or perceived negative consequences on the job as a result of the mental health disorder. People who currently have mental health disorders. Breakdown of conditions. Maybe some conditions are more severe and some are less severe, so you might want to know what conditions are most likely to result in negative consequences for an employee on the job. Belief about mental health conditions versus diagnosis for mental health conditions. People who report mental health disorders versus people who have been diagnosed with mental health conditions. Just knowing those percentages could be interesting. Distribution of mental health disorders for people who work in IT functions and may be spread out across different job titles. Have you sought treatment? Maybe the percentage of people who seek treatment who are afraid of negative consequences in the job place versus the percentage of people who have sought treatment who are not afraid of negative consequences. So are people afraid to seek treatment because they fear negative consequences in their jobs? If you have a mental health issue, do you feel that it interferes with your work when being treated effectively and when not being treated effectively? People's ages and genders, so you can look at distribution of mental health issues and consequences by age and by gender, by state, country, work position, and whether you work remotely or not. And then also just looking at work position versus whether they work remotely or not. So which IT job functions are most likely to support working remotely and which are least likely to support working remotely. So that could be an interesting question to ask independent of the mental health questions in here. And then here are the number of unique values. So self-employed, that's going to be yes or no. And then how many employees does your company or organization have? I'm surprised there's only 6 values there. I think this is probably a survey over a small number of organizations. Is your employer primarily a tech company? That's a yes or no question. Is your primary role related to IT? Yes or no? Does your employee provide mental health benefits as part of health coverage? We'll look at the values there. And then a bunch of other questions in the middle that we just looked at. And then 47 states, 53 countries, 48 states or territories, 264 job positions, and then 3 categories of whether they work remotely or not. Okay, so how many employees does your company or organization have? There's actually different ranges specified, including not a number. So 26, so 6 through 25, 26 through 100, 100 through 500. Then this is probably 500 through 1,000, and then more than 1,000. Maybe there's less than 6 as well. I have to check. Is your employer primarily a tech organization? So 1 means yes and 0 means no, and then some rows have not been specified. And then is your primary role within your company related to tech or IT? 1 is yes, 0 is no. These were probably the number 1 and the number 0. They got converted to floats. Does your employer provide mental health benefits? Not eligible for coverage. No. Not a number. Yes. So there's some interesting answers there. States, countries, territories, job titles, backend developer, backend developer. I might actually want to look at all of the job titles. Do you work remotely? Sometimes, never, or always. So that would be interesting. So I think we can clean up these Boolean values and we can split them maybe. But most of the data looks like we mainly just want to filter in rows or filter out rows that have responses in them. And I think there's some interesting results that we could pull out of this.